Hello and welcome to another edition of Civitas Conversations. I'm Richard Reinsch, your host. Today we are joined by Mike Munger, a frequent contributor to Civitas Outlook, a professor of political science and economics at Duke University, to discuss his article, Milton Friedman Lives. Mike is on location in western part of Virginia at James Buchanan Camp. So that explains the rustic conditions he is operating in today.
It is a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Mike, the essay, when you and I were talking about it, before you wrote it, before we published it, was this idea of Milton Friedman being a piñata recently, and obviously he is on people's minds. We have the pretty good biography by Jennifer Burns, The Last Conservative, awkward title, but nevertheless, I think a book worth engaging in if you want to learn more about Milton Friedman. He, as you note in your piece, he's long been someone that members of the left have wanted to criticize and attack, often for scurrilous reasons. You note a few of those in your piece. Former Secretary of Labor during the Clinton administration, Robert Reich, accuses him of being sort of a Pinochet tyrant enabler. Naomi Klein, he loved the crisis of Chile because it allowed him to foment free market revolution, things like this, things that we can expect from the left. But what's also new is things coming from the populist right. And you note those criticisms as well. They set the stage for us. A lot of our listeners have heard of Milton Friedman, haven't read him that closely. Who is Milton Friedman? And sketch for us, what were his chief accomplishments in economic policy such that he should be so attacked?
Milton Friedman was actually a macroeconomist by training, and in some ways by temperament. He was interested in empirical work and models explaining the business cycle. He was particularly interested in the effects that changes in the money supply had on the aggregate economy. He became known as one of the leaders of the monetarist school. And in fact, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, one of the first Nobel Prizes awarded, because he had made such important contributions to monetarism. The monetarism was an alternative to Keynesianism. If you ever took a macroeconomics class as an undergraduate, as a sophomore, perhaps you learned that those are two great schools of thought. You may not remember much about them, but you're likely to remember Milton Friedman as a scholar. But he was also one of the first public intellectuals. And I think, Richard, you probably have heard people ask this, where is the modern Milton Friedman? Mm-hmm. Because he had a book, Free to Choose. He had that on PBS, of all things, a very famous, very well-received video series. He wrote for Newsweek magazine once or twice a month. And so he made comments on public policy at a time when that was fairly unusual for economists of his stature. And I think most of what he is remembered for by the public is his work as a public intellectual. His credentials as a scholar, though, at the University of Chicago are untarnished. So we're sort of honing in just on the part when I say Milton Friedman lives. He lives in part because he is on the graduate reading list of every macroeconomics class. That's not a problem. What's strange is, and one of the other people that I mentioned in my piece is the novelist Cory Doctorow, actually says that if he's in the dentist chair, he amuses himself by imagining Milton Friedman being tortured in hell forever. So what is it that causes this kind of not just dislike? A lot of people on the left dislike me, but no one's imagining that I'm burning in hell.
Yeah. So on one part, we have Milton Friedman, scholar, also someone who trained many graduate students at the University of Chicago.
Yes.
Monetarist, someone advocating for sound money policy. That's, in the piece, frequently the advice that he would give is have a non-discretionary rule for your monetary policy.
Well, and he also advocated for floating international exchange rates, which we now have. They're uncontroversial. And he was opposed to the draft, something that the left was also in favor of, something that we now have. We have an all-volunteer army. So many of the things that Friedman advocated for have just happened. They worked, and they're kind of uncontroversial. The things that people are upset with Friedman about are advocating openness of trade, advocating having corporations seek profits, and famously having consulted with dictators.
Yeah. So thinking about that, I mean, J.D. Vance frequently, you know J.D. Vance's interview with Michael Knowles of the Daily Wire, that in respect of Friedman's economic thought, that he no longer reigns in the Republican Party. Who now reigns it's Alexander Hamilton. But I don't think really, J.D. Vance really drills down into what does that even mean that Alexander Hamilton would supplant Milton Friedman. And you note it's about tariffs, it's about industrial policy. Milton Friedman, though, I think would be someone who would argue not merely that tariffs and industrial policy are bad policies, but that they strike at core notions of individual freedom and why individuals work and how we're able to buy goods at the most clear, transparent price, things like that. And J.D. Vance means to displace that with it's not just a populism, but it's a return, as you say, to mercantilism.
Well, what's interesting is that J.D. Vance is at once saying that these views of laissez-faire that we get from the 80s are obsolete. And so what we should do is go from the 1980s to the 1780s. So it is a return to a time that never was. Adam Smith, to my mind, debunked and demolished the arguments for mercantilism. Vance is actually, to be fair, Vance is making a slightly different argument, and that is that laissez-faire, keeping our hands off and letting the emergent properties of markets dictate the allocation of resources, relied on a certain level of Christian self-governance. That is, that people had a moral sense that had been inculcated into them by their church and by their society, and somewhere in the 1960s and 1970s that broke down. And so now we can no longer rely on markets. And that's why the obsolete party, the line about Hamilton is clever. It's true that Hamilton advocated for a more planned economy, but the steel man version of Vance's argument, I think, is worth taking seriously. And that is that people no longer are capable of self-governance because we've lost our moral compass. And so the state has to step up and provide the moral background that people have now lost.
So let me ask you to respond to that, because I know what I would say to that, but how do you evaluate that claim? Not just on how would Friedman respond, maybe?
Well, it would be astonishing if the government, and to me, the government is not a thing, it's made up of people. If people are not capable of self-government as individuals, wouldn't it be astonishing if we could take a giant mob of them and then put one person in charge of that, and then that person would be in charge of self-government? Because even if you think we start out with someone that you actually believe in, and believe in, depending on what party you're in, maybe you have some favorite champion, it's unlikely to be sustained, and I don't think it would work very well in the first place. So I would say that the solution is not let's have the government do it for us and eliminate all sense of moral responsibility, but try to return to an era where we inculcate in children and we reward adults for having old-fashioned self-governance. The solution is not to have the government do it in our stead. So like Tocqueville advocated, what we need is individuals having a civic republicanism, not saying the state will do it for us. If we go in that direction, if we go in the direction that J.D. Vance is advocating, we're going to pass a point of no return where the state is going to have to be the nanny because no one else is capable of doing it. And Richard, the bad news is the state's not capable of doing it either.
No, I mean, as you know, the state is just us. It's just people who perhaps style themselves more clever, more technically proficient, stepping in and making policy. And of course, the only way to become self-governing is to make choices, learn from them, experience the consequences. Flourish or not, as the case may be. but then learn to flourish. But I think it also, I mean, this constant use of Alexander Hamilton as the noble founder, who actually understands exactly what was required at that time of the Republic. I mean, how should we evaluate that claim? Because this is something you see all populist right figures keep recurring to Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton, to his credit, did understand what was required to create a sustainable financial system. And it is true that Jefferson and Madison in the 1810s acknowledged that Hamilton had been right to try to centralize at least some power to borrow. And then Hamilton had a policy on trade that was mostly targeted against England. And so what I would say is, if modern day Hamiltonians wish actually to do this by analogy, then we should not be concerned about international trade. We should be concerned about China. There may be that there are particular security concerns that would lead us not to become overly dependent on China. That's fair enough. So the China shock that David Autor wrote about, that all the neo-Hamiltonians will cite, fair enough. But this was not a general problem with free trade. In Hamilton's time, it was with Great Britain. In our time, it is arguably with China. And so we may want to put that under a different category. But the idea that we need to protect American citizens from being able to buy cheap, well, inexpensive, but high quality products from Canada is crazy.
Yeah, treating Canada like North Korea.
Yes.
As we've done. You also, in the essay, you note Milton Friedman's famous New York Times piece in 1970 on ethical responsibilities of corporations, and Friedman arguing essentially what corporations exist to do within ethical, rule of law boundaries is to make profit. That's why they're organized. That's why they exist. That's embedded in the corporate law of our country in every state. And this has come back again, obviously, and it's come back again in Vance new right populist circles. They want something like what the left used to advocate in terms of stakeholder theory. So they take their aim at Milton Friedman. What was Milton Friedman saying in that essay, and why is it true, or is it contingently true?
Well, we could talk for an hour just about that one essay. I actually went down a rabbit hole this morning and read it, and then looked up some other things. What Friedman was responding, this essay was in the New York Times Magazine in 1970, and he was responding to a particular question. And the question is, should for-profit corporations change what they do? Should managers, should CEOs of for-profit corporations behave in a way that's more socially responsible? And Friedman took a pretty philosophical approach to that. So let's break that down. What would it mean for them to be more socially responsible? So a corporation is a legal fiction that is created around a contract. That contract is between owners and managers. Now, some corporations are proprietorships, and a proprietor is both the owner and the manager. And Friedman explicitly says, I'm not talking about those. What I'm talking about is managers who do not own. They are hired to carry out some kind of function. And the function can vary. There's a lot of different kinds of corporations. Some of them might be eleemosinaries. So eleemosinaries are corporations that have specific social charters where they're supposed to provide maybe social service. So an orphanage, a hospital. And Friedman says, I'm not talking about those. Managers of those are supposed to carry out what they're doing in the contract. I'm talking about the kind of corporation that are called for-profit corporations. Those contracts, corporate law would say that the person who is hired, their job is to increase the value of the stock because that's the reason that stockholders hired him. So he then gives 4 different qualifications. First, I've already talked about, which is the contract. That is, it's a for-profit corporation only. The second is that the things that corporations can do to earn profits must be entirely within the law. The third is that they have to be entirely within the ethical norms of the society. So even if it's not illegal, you shouldn't do it if it's unethical. Finally, he said no deception or fraud. So what he said was the job of the corporate manager is to try to increase the profits of the corporation within the law, within ethics, and without deception or fraud, so that the stockholders could engage in the form of social responsibility that they found most attractive. The alternative, and he notes this very explicitly, is that you're saying that you want the manager to do something that stockholders do not want. So suppose I'm a big fan of the opera. And so I'll take 10% of the corporation's profits and donate it to the nearby opera. Well, that's not the form of charity that my stockholders wanted. If they want to, they can donate to it. So if charity takes place, it has to take place at the individual level. There's no reason to think that all of the individual stockholders will have the same idea. And the manager, it's not their money anyway. So why would the manager be donating money that is not theirs? The money belongs to the stockholders. If they would like to make charitable contributions, that's fine. So this essay is completely mischaracterized. It's always Gordon Gekko. Greed, for want of a better word, is good.
Yeah.
Well, Friedman never said that. He never advocated for that. What he's saying is there should be charity, and the charity should be the well-informed and targeted charity of the stockholders who are the ones who own the profits, not the sort of loose charity of the manager who is donating someone else's money to their pet cause.
So as I see this criticism of the Friedman essay and of shareholder capitalism more broadly, it's this desire to make the corporation a additional device to regulate society on behalf of the government without doing it in a heavy-handed, let's take over private assets, but we can actually use them for our purposes.
Well, it's fairly
which has found a way in the Trump administration. I mean, there has been a movement in this regard.
Friedman literally says that it is a kind of shadow socialism because it is accomplishing what socialism wants to accomplish without actually using the mechanism of state ownership of the means of production. So if what you're doing is asserting social control over profits, you can get a kind of socialist, and by socialist, he's not talking about Russia. He means a collectivist rather than individualist conception of what constitutes charity and social good. So if the state can, through moral suasion and jawboning, force corporations to do what the government wants, and this is not an ideological point, it could be left or right. Friedman's not making a left or right point, which is what you just said. The current government is trying to get social control over corporations in a way that it could not achieve by law, but it's going to do it just by threats.
Or taking ownership positions.
Yeah.
Third point you make, was Milton Friedman a friend enabler of dictators?
There are a number of papers then that have been written about this, and there's a famous one by a friend of mine, Leonidas Montes, and I'll suggest that you put up a link to that one because I think there are people have heard this for so long they're kind of skeptical. Friedman had an open policy. He would advise almost anyone, and his advice was always the same. It was pretty much something you could Xerox. You need to open up your economy. You need to free labor to be move around, and you need to make it possible to start new businesses without a lot of regulatory and tax burdens. He told everybody that. He did famously have one meeting with Auguste Pinochet in Chile. I was just in Chile this May, for a month. They're trying to pass a new constitution. People still talk about this. In that meeting, apparently it was at 5:30 in the afternoon. Friedman talked for half an hour, and then Pinochet did what I probably would have done if it were 5:30 and I were pretty tired and some economist is speaking to me in a language that's not my first. Write that up and send it to me. So send me a memo.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's the entire extent of the interaction. Friedman met for 2 hours at different times with the leaders of China. He met with a number of authoritarian dictators. Now, it is possible that it had more of an influence in Chile, but in fact, Chile was already moving in that direction. There are two countries that I would say most took Milton Friedman's advice. One was Chile, which became the wealthiest country in Latin America, and China, which became the fastest growing country in Asia. And so why is it that we blame him for China, but don't credit for Chile, but don't credit him for China? Because the Dong reforms between 1978 and 1980 are exactly those that were advocated for by Friedman. So there's a strange blindness, a strange focus on Chile, which, as Leonidas Montes points out in that article, they're just misplaced anyway. He gave the same advice to all the dictators. So that one is just bizarre. I have a hard time understanding that one.
You know, it seems as we conclude, it's as this push to really displace free market thinking as sort of a leading part of American thinking when it comes to domestic policy, international trade policy, that it stands to reason you have to knock off Milton Friedman, or he's a part of your argument in that regard. And that's kind of where we are right now.
And the interesting thing is that if you want to have industrial policy, it is certainly true that you're going to have to take on the arguments of Milton Friedman. But as I say in the essay, I think it would be odd. Friedman was a pragmatic empiricist. And if he were alive today, he would immediately concede, yes, there are problems with China. Yes, there are problems with part of the economy. He was a pragmatist in the sense that he would say, if this is what you're trying to accomplish, let's try to do it in the most efficient way. And as I have written in the last few years, and a number of other people have, if what you're trying to accomplish is the growth, expansion of certain core industries, and industrial policy is probably the worst way to go about it. So even if that's your objective, a better way to do it would be to have some kind of subsidies or tax breaks rather than government investment. And I'm making air quotes. Government investment is just the takeover of government ownership, and that's literally socialism. So it would be astonishing if the people who run our government were also better at running business than current business people are.
Mike Munger, this has been excellent. Thank you so much for coming on to discuss Milton Friedman, the legacy of his economic thinking. We appreciate it so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.